The White House is pushing back on a recent CNN poll that shows declining support for the war in Ukraine. But my next guests say support and attention to the war is needed now more than ever, as well as attention on Putin's regime. Joining me now is Evgenia Kara-Murza. She is the wife of imprisoned Russian opposition politician Vladimir Kara-Murza, who spoke out live on my show and was jailed in Russia hours later. Also with me is Yonah Diamond. He's an international human rights lawyer and the creator of the Price of Conviction podcast and part of Vladimir's advocacy team. Thank you both so much for joining us tonight.
Thanks for having us, Sarah.
I'm going to start with you, Evgenia. You know, as I just mentioned, your husband, Vladimir, was on my show back in April of 2022, and he was being very outspoken about what he thought of the Putin regime and the war in particular. And then he was jailed hours later. He'd already been poisoned twice. He's since been convicted by the Russian courts and sentenced to 25 years in prison. I know he is appealing, but how is he doing now, both mentally and physically?
Well, thank you very much for paying attention to Vladimir's case, Sarah, and thank you very much for shedding light on the situation in Russia in general. Well, Vladimir's appeal actually was rejected just a few days ago. So the court left the sentence unchanged, the sentence of 25 years of strict regime. So now the next step is the transfer to the strict regime penal colony. We don't know when it's going to happen because, of course, in today's Russia, we're not dealing with a normal legal system. We're not dealing with independent courts. So there is no knowing beforehand what might happen and what to expect. He might be transferred tomorrow or in 3 months. We only know that this transfer is a very dangerous period in the life of any prisoner, especially political prisoner in the Russian Federation today, because the authorities very often lose prisoners during transfer.
Evgenia, when you say that they could be lost, and if then they do make it to these penal colonies, are you worried that your husband may not make it through his imprisonment and through this transfer?
Absolutely, as is the case for any political prisoner in the Russian Federation today. Basically, the regime is currently using all measures, all repressive measures that we used in the Soviet Union against anti-war protesters. And these measures, beside those Stalin-era prison terms that go up to 25 years for so-called high treason, these measures also include extreme violence, physical violence, sexual violence, denial of medical care, punitive psychiatry, you name it.
Evgenia, you are describing torture on many different levels, both physically and psychologically. And I think a lot of people would be extremely disturbed to hear that that's how things go, although we have seen this in other cases as well in Russia in particular. Yonah, I do want to go to what Vladimir told me during our interview. Let's listen to a little bit of the interview we did in 2022 before he was jailed.
This regime that is in power in our country today, it's not just corrupt, it's not just kleptocratic, it's not just authoritarian. It is a regime of murderers, and it is important to say it out loud. And it is really tragic, frankly, I have no other word for this, that it took a large-scale war in the middle of Europe, which Vladimir Putin is now conducting against Ukraine, for most Western leaders to finally open their eyes to the true nature of this regime.
Why is it that those words scare Vladimir Putin to the point where he would jail this person who is simply saying what he thinks about the regime?
Thanks, Sarah. Those are the exact same things that Evgenia cited as the evidence that was used against Vladimir, pointing out the culture of corruption and criminality and impunity that are the root causes of this war. That is, we would not have a war in Ukraine. We wouldn't have untold destruction on our environment, on global food shortages. We wouldn't have Putin sending tens of thousands of Russians and Ukrainians to death if it weren't for his regime and their decisions. And so Vladimir brings this into direct focus. And this is exactly what Vladimir has dedicated his life to standing up against, to holding the Putin regime accountable and to laying the groundwork for democracy in Russia.
I want to talk a little bit about what is happening in Russia and what has happened during the time that Vladimir Kara-Murza has been imprisoned. You've had Evgenia Prigozhin actually try and use his own military to stage a failed coup, if you will, when it comes to marching its way into Moscow. They didn't go all the way, but there was a plan to do so. And yet, he's walking around free and still able to do some of the things he does. And he has a whole army that he commands in the mercenaries that he commands, the Wagner mercenaries. Why is it that someone like Vladimir Kara-Murza is imprisoned and being put in this position, and not someone who actually went forward and became what looked like, and at first was called, an enemy of the state in Russia? I'll start with you, Evgenia.
I see the situation as a very simple one. Evgeny Prigozhin is part of the system. And as part of the system, he does not really represent any danger to the system itself, to the regime in the Kremlin, because he's driven by the same interests that Vladimir Putin and his close circle, whoever supports him, are driven by. The same interests. And these interests contradict the interests of those people who, like my husband, speak against the regime and speak against the war. And those people, those people represent a much bigger threat, existential threat to the regime, because they denounce the crimes of the regime and they question its policies and they condemn its policies, and they do it publicly. And they show to the Russian population that Russia can be different. It can be a democracy. It can be a country that will not be a threat to itself and its neighbors.
Evgenia, Yonah, thank you so much.